and welcome to Clumsy Crafting. I am your host, Bray Wright. Now, the reason the show is called Clumsy Crafting is because every single time you learn a new skill, there's always going to be a period of clumsiness, awkwardness, where you just don't really know what you're doing, you're just kind of fumbling around. And you know what? I get it. I'm there currently with video and audio editing, you're there with crafting, but you know what? We're here to learn together. Now here I've got size 4 medium worsted weight yarn. It is a acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn has some downsides, but I'm not going to get into that in this episode. I probably will in a later episode. Size 4 worsted weight, medium weight, they're all pretty much the same. They generally mean this medium-sized yarn. It's the most standard yarn you're going to find. You can probably find it in pretty much any store across the country. If you want different sizes, you're probably going to need to look online or go to a specialty store, but worsted weight you can almost always find somewhere. The needles I'm using right now are size 6 needles. Ordinarily, you'd use size 8, maybe size 7, but size 6 contrasted against the aqua yarn better, so we're just going to go with it. Most patterns will tell you to use size 8 needles and size 4 yarn, at least when you're starting out. However, really, it depends on what your knitting type is. If you're a much tighter knitter, you're going to need bigger needles or bigger yarn. If you're a much loose knitter, you might want to go down a size. Really, anything that you need a specific size for, you're going to want to test it out to find the gauge. I'm not going to get into that right now, but generally you're going to start out with size 8 needles and size 4 yarn. Or whatever size you feel like. It's your knitting. It's up to you. Now I'm going to teach you two different cast-ons real quick. Casting on is how you start a project. It's basically how you get the stitches on. What you're going to do is you're going to make this little loop. All right? And then once you have the loop, you're going to take the tail of the yarn and run it underneath the loop. And then you're going to thread the needle into the loop and under the tail and then pull it so that it makes your first stitch. Then you're going to tighten that to however tight you want the stitch. Then, for the most simplest, most basic cast on you can get, you're going to insert the needle through the back of the stitch. You're going to want to make sure that your first needle is on top, your second needle is on bottom. Wrap the yarn that's connected to the ball, not the tail of the yarn that's connected to the ball, around the needle, and then pull up a stitch. So you've got 2 stitches connected at the bottom. Then you're going to take the second stitch on the second needle in your right hand and put it back on the left needle. You now have 2 stitches. Now we're going to go up to 9 stitches, so just do this a few more times. Go in through the back, wrap the needle, pull up a stitch, and then put it back on the other needle. Now you're just going to keep doing this until you've got 9 stitches. In through the back, wrap, pick up, put on the needle. Now I'm going to show you a much fancier cast on, and this is called a long tail cast on or a continental cast on. I prefer long tail. It just makes more sense. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the yarn and you're going to hold it on your needle and you're going to wrap it around 10 to 11 times. We're only doing 9 stitches, but you want to make sure you've got the extra room to work with. So once you've done that, pull it off. make another loop, run either the tail or the working yarn underneath the loop, weave your needle through, and then pull up a stitch. This will be your first stitch. Now you're going to take the working yarn that's connected to the ball and the tail, and you're going to hold it in your left hand. You're going to use your bottom 3 fingers to hold the two strands of yarn. And then you're going to take your pointer finger and your thumb and put it through the yarn and pull it apart until you've got like a diamond shape. You're going to twist your thumb until you've got basically a loop. And then you're going to stick your needle through the loop on your thumb, go underneath the yarn held by your finger, and pull it through the loop on your thumb. And then you're going to let go of it and tighten it on the needle. This should create a second stitch. And you're just going to go and you're going to keep doing that. You're going to tilt your thumb until you've got a loop, go in, pick up the other thread, pull it through the loop, and then let go so that you've got, again, a third stitch. And you're just going to keep doing that. Take it as slow as you need to. Rewatch the instruction as much as you need to. It's a little bit complicated. I often have to rewatch it, but that's how you do a long tail cast on. Once you have 9 stitches, you can stop, you're good. You'll notice I have a lot of extra tail left over. That's on me. I overcompensated to try to make sure that I didn't have too little left. Generally in knitting, you do want to overestimate rather than underestimate, but again, up to you. I would advise you to start with the simpler cast on until you get really good at it, and then you can do the long tail cast on. But if you prefer the long tail cast on, go ahead, run with it. So now we're going to start knitting. Take your second needle in your right hand, and you're going to, once again, insert it through the back of the stitch. You're going to slip in through the back of the first stitch. You're going to wrap the yarn around the needle just like you did when we were casting on. Pull up a stitch so that you've got 2 stitches connected at the bottom. But this time, instead of putting it back on the needle, you're going to drop the first stitch. This will mean that you will have 8 stitches on your left needle and 1 stitch on your right. And you're going to keep doing this. You're going to slip in through the back of the stitch, wrap the second needle with the yarn, pull up a stitch, and drop the first stitch. And you're going to keep doing this until you reach the end of the row. Once you've reached the end of the row, you have officially knitted 1 row. You'll notice that there's a little bit of extra yarn at the bottom now. That's because you have knitted 1 row. We're going to knit 4 more rows so that you have 5 rows of knitting in total. So just keep going. Go. What you're going to do now is you're going to take the needle in your right hand, switch it over to your left hand. This is called turning. And then grab the empty needle and put it in your right hand. And then you should be good to restart knitting. Pull the yarn to the back, insert the second needle through the first stitch, wrap, pull up a stitch, drop the other stitch. I might not be explaining this the best, but just watch the video. It makes a lot more sense when you see it. In through the back, wrap, pull up, drop. Slip, wrap, pull, drop. That's going to be your mantra the whole time you're knitting. Once again, we've hit the end of a row. Now you've knitted 2 rows. You'll notice, again, there's more yarn on the bottom because we've knitted more stitches. Thing is, when you keep doing a row of knitting after knitting after knitting, you're doing a garter stitch. It's one of the most common ways of knitting out there. So whenever you see a pattern that says do garter stitch for so-and-so number of rows, this is what they mean. You're just knitting straight on the whole time. Once you've knitted 5 rows, we're going to stop with the knitting. Take a look at it. This is your garter stitch. Amazing. Now we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a stockinette stitch. This is the second most common kind of knitting. And this is where you alternate knitting rows with purling rows. So we're going to purl row 6. And you're probably sitting there thinking, what's purling? I just learned what knitting is. What is purling? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. It's basically knitting backwards. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the knitting and you're going to, again, put the needle into your left hand, the empty needle in your right. Only this time, you're going to leave the yarn facing you. And you're going to take your right needle and put it in through the front of the stitch. So it will be facing towards you. Then, once again, you're going to wrap, pull up a stitch, and drop. It's the exact same thing as knitting, you're just doing it in the opposite direction. So again, your needles and your yarn will be facing you, as opposed to knitting where your needles and yarn were facing away from you. So look, you've purled 1 row. If you'll notice, all of the bumps of the stitches will be facing you. And when you turn the work around, you'll notice that the rows are now forming these little arrow type things, and it'll be pushed in compared to the garter stitch. Now that you've turned it, you're just going to knit this row. So you're going to go in through the back, wrap, pull up a stitch, drop. And you're just going to do that for this entire row 7. Row 8, you're going to purl again. So you're going to go in through the front of the stitch so that your needles are facing you. Wrap the second needle, pull up a stitch, drop. Again, it's just knitting in the opposite direction. And when you turn it, after you finish row 8, when you turn it, you'll notice you'll have more of those little arrows on the flat side and more bumps on the other side. This flat side is called your right side, whereas the side with all the bumps is the wrong side. They will sometimes use this term with garter stitch, but it can be really hard to tell. It's a lot easier to tell with stockinette because one side will look like neat little arrows, whereas the other side will be just a lot of bumps. Again, we're going to knit row 9, and we're just going to go through and we're going to knit plain and simple. And now you've knitted a neat little project. And you'll notice there's these bumpy rows of garter stitch and these flat rows of stockinette, just as I've said. You'll also notice that even though we have 9 stitches and we've knitted 9 rows, we don't have a perfect square. And that's because, well, rows are always a little bit flatter than stitches are wide. It's really, again, with that gauge thing, you're really going to need to knit it out yourself and work it out to see what a square looks like, depending on your yarn and needle size and tension. So don't worry about it being not a perfect square. It's really not supposed to. It's supposed to be a little rectangular. Now I'm going to teach you how to cast off, and this is basically how you finish a project. Now there are a lot of different ways of doing cast-offs depending on what you're knitting and what the project is, but I'm just going to teach you a very simple cast-off. You can also do a cast-off while purling, but I'm just going to show you it through knitting because that's how I learned how to do it. Now see, what you're going to do is you're going to knit the first stitch. Go in through the back, wrap, pull, drop. And you're going to knit the second stitch. Go in through the back, wrap, pull, drop. You're going to take the first stitch and pull it over the second stitch and the tip of the needle. Then you'll only have one stitch on your right needle. And you're going to keep doing that. You're going to knit the next stitch. And then pull the previous stitch over. Knit the next stitch and pull the previous stitch over. And you're going to keep doing that until you get down to the last stitch. Ordinarily, once you reach the last stitch, you'd cut the yarn, run it through the stitch, pull it all tight so it's a knot, and then weave in the ends. But let's say you did something wrong in your work and you want to go back and fix it. Well, now we're going to do a thing called frogging. It means unraveling. It's just the knitting term for unraveling your knitting. And there's a few different ways to do that. And the most easiest way is to simply pull out your needles and yank the yarn until you undo all the stitches. Again, really easy, but if you're only trying to go down a certain amount, then this can be a little bit hard to do and a little hectic because you can't really get your needle back in easily. Another option is if you're only trying to fix one stitch, you can just go through and undo the one stitch. But depending on what you're knitting, this can get stuck or be hard to do, or it can be hard to pull it the right way. So you don't want to do this too much. And you can also weave a needle into the row with the mistake or the row below the mistake and just pull the yarn until it hits the needle, and then it will stop and you won't unravel anymore. But for now, we're just going to fully unravel this project because we don't really need this project. So we're just going to pull it all until it's all completely gone. And there you go. Now you know how to cast on, knit, purl, cast off, and frog your knitting. Anyway, I am your host, Bray Wright, and this is Clumsy Crafting. And I hope you had a wonderful time crafting with me. Have a nice day.